New York City. Look at that skyline. It doesn't just scrape the sky, it screams ambition, a declaration of power and possibility etched in steel and glass. This is a city forged in the crucible of relentless drive, built by titans of industry whose names we still know, and by the endless, crashing waves of immigrants who arrived with little more than hope. They all left their indelible mark on the soul of this island. We know the grand, public stories, the Dutch laying the first cobblestones, the English establishing their rule, the Irish building the infrastructure, the Italians shaping entire neighborhoods. Their names are carved into the very streets and buildings, a visible part of the city's official narrative. But there's another story, a parallel history that runs just beneath the surface. It is a kind of secret history, written not in city charters or official laws, but in quiet resilience, in fierce intellect, and in the sheer, unyielding will to exist. It's the profound story of how a tiny, desperate, and unwelcome band of refugees, arriving with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs, laid the cornerstone for what would become the largest, most vibrant, and most influential Jewish metropolis on Earth. This community, which began with just a handful of souls, today numbers around 960,000 people within the city proper. It is the heart of a metropolitan area that is home to over 1.4 million Jews, a testament to a journey of unimaginable scope. So, how did this happen? How did a people who arrived with so little, facing so much hostility, come to shape so much of the city's destiny? This is the epic story of three distinct waves of Jewish immigration, each a dramatic response to a different global crisis, all converging on this one singular point on the map. It's the story of how their unique culture, their relentless drive, and their ancient story of survival became utterly and forever inseparable from the story of New York itself. The history of Jewish New York, and by extension the history of Jewish America, doesn't begin with a grand proclamation or a welcoming ceremony. It begins on a splintered wooden dock in a muddy, developing port town called New Amsterdam during the sweltering, humid late summer of 1654. It begins with just 23 forgotten refugees. The old records describe them simply as big and little, a stark phrase that conjures images of weary men, frightened women, and exhausted children, all of them utterly broke after a journey that could only be described as hell. They were never even supposed to be here. They were Sephardic Jews running for their lives from the collapse of a tolerant enclave in Dutch Brazil, desperately escaping the long, terrifying arm of the Portuguese Inquisition. Their escape ship was then attacked by pirates, who stripped them of every last valuable possession. A final, cruel twist of fate diverted their rescue vessel here to the shores of Manhattan. But when they finally arrived, they were not met with open arms or even basic charity. They were met with a locked gate and the raw, undisguised hostility of the colony's iron-fisted Director General, Peter Stuyvesant. He saw them not as refugees, but as a burden and a threat, contemptuously calling them a deceitful race and hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. He immediately wrote to his superiors in Amsterdam, the Dutch West India Company, demanding permission to expel them immediately. The story of Jewish New York could have, and perhaps should have, ended right there, a forgotten footnote. But it didn't. In that moment of utter rejection, it began with a demand to be let in, a demand to exist, and in that simple, powerful act of defiance, a secret history was born. Part 1. The Seed, 1654, mid-19th century. Those 23 Sephardic Jews standing before a furious Peter Stuyvesant were the very definition of unwanted. Fleeing the Portuguese takeover of Recife, Brazil, they were most likely attempting the perilous journey back to the relative safety of Amsterdam. But their voyage, which included being rescued from pirates, left them deeply indebted to the captain of the ship that brought them to New Amsterdam. When they couldn't pay the fare upon arrival, an incensed Stuyvesant seized what little they had left and sold it all at public auction. When the proceeds still weren't enough to cover the debt, he had 2 of the refugees thrown into a primitive jail. In a scathing letter to the Dutch West India Company, Stuyvesant argued that the Jews should be required in a friendly way to depart, voicing a deep-seated fear that their very presence would infect and trouble this new colony. It was a wall of pure, unadulterated prejudice, built on centuries of European anti-Semitism that had been carried across the Atlantic. But the refugees had an unexpected ace up their sleeve. The Dutch West India Company wasn't an institution run on religious dogma, but on the cold, hard logic of commerce. Its directors, some of whom were influential Jewish shareholders themselves, understood that fledgling colonies needed industrious settlers to survive and thrive. These Jewish investors argued forcefully on behalf of the 23 refugees, reminding the company of the significant loyalty and economic contributions Jews had made to their ventures in Brazil. The message sent from Amsterdam back to Stuyvesant was blunt and unambiguous: let them stay. This ruling, however, came with heavy strings attached. The Jews could live and trade in New Amsterdam, but they were explicitly required to support their own poor, ensuring they wouldn't be a drain on the colony. Furthermore, they were forbidden from holding public office, opening a retail shop, or, most crucially, building a public synagogue. It was a grudging and limited tolerance, a precarious foothold, not a welcome mat. But for a people with nowhere else to go, it was enough. From this fragile, barely planted seed, a community slowly began to sprout. One of the original 23 refugees, a man named Asser Levy, quickly proved to be a quiet but tenacious revolutionary. When Stuyvesant levied a special tax on the Jewish settlers to pay for others to serve in the Citizens' Guard in their stead, Levy refused to pay. Instead, he boldly demanded the right to stand guard himself, to perform the duties of a citizen. After a determined 2-year fight, he won. It was the first recorded assertion of civil rights by a Jew in North America, a quiet but profound insistence on being a full citizen, not merely a tolerated guest. In that same year, 1654, the small community founded Congregation Shearith Israel, the remnant of Israel, which stands today as the oldest Jewish congregation in the United States. A year later, they purchased a plot of land for a cemetery, the first tangible piece of New York that they could truly call their own, a place to lay their dead to rest. In this new world, while they were forced to worship in rented rooms and attics for decades, they finally built their own synagogue on Mill Street in 1730, the very first in North America. For the next century and a half, the community grew, but at a glacial pace. These were the Sephardim, cosmopolitan Jews with deep roots in Spain and Portugal. By the time of the American Revolution, there were still only a few hundred Jewish people in New York, but their legacy was immense. They had set a powerful precedent. They had proven that a Jewish community could not only survive in this new world, but could put down permanent roots and successfully demand its rights. They were the seed, planted in profoundly hostile soil, waiting patiently for the right conditions to finally bloom. And those conditions were coming, not from Spain or Portugal, but from the turbulent heart of Central Europe. Part 2. The First Wave, Building the Foundation, mid-19th century. The second major chapter in New York's Jewish story doesn't begin with a desperate, chaotic flight from religious persecution, but with a more calculated and orderly escape from a suffocating and stagnant Europe. Starting in the 1830s and continuing for decades, a new kind of Jewish immigrant began arriving in the city's harbor. They were not Sephardic. They were Ashkenazi. They didn't speak the Spanish-inflected Ladino. They spoke German and Yiddish. They were fleeing a continent in the throes of convulsive change. The Napoleonic Wars had redrawn maps and upended societies. The Industrial Revolution was causing massive economic and social upheaval, and a new, politically charged anti-Semitism was on the rise, making life in the German states increasingly unbearable. They were looking for peace, economic opportunity, and a society where the ceiling on their ambition wasn't predetermined by their religion. America, and especially the booming port of New York, was the embodiment of that dream. This wave was fundamentally different from the first. These German-speaking Jews often arrived with more formal education, more financial resources, and a modern worldview shaped by the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment. They did not wish to remain a separate, insular group. They aspired to become German Americans, and ultimately, simply Americans. Initially, they settled alongside their non-Jewish German countrymen in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, which at the time was so thoroughly German, it was known as Kleindeutschland, or Little Germany. They frequented the same beer halls, socialized in the same clubs, and read the same German-language newspapers. But critically, they also began building their own, distinctly Jewish-American infrastructure. Where the Sephardim had maintained one synagogue for over 150 years, the Germans began building new ones with astonishing speed. They founded B'nai Jeshurun in 1825, and in 1845, a group seeking to modernize their faith established Temple Emmanuel, which would quickly become the magnificent flagship of the new Reform Judaism movement in America. They were actively blending American customs with ancient traditions, creating something entirely new, but their influence radiated far beyond the synagogue walls. This was the generation that constructed the institutional foundations of modern American Jewish life. They founded crucial service and fraternal organizations like B'nai B'rith in 1848, dedicated to community service and philanthropy. They were ambitious financiers and clever merchants, and they poured their considerable energy into the city's burgeoning economy. And as they found staggering success, they moved. They pioneered the classic New York immigrant trajectory. Arrive downtown in a crowded ethnic enclave, prosper through hard work, and move uptown to a life of comfort and influence. As the German Jewish community grew wealthier, they left Kleindeutschland behind for the grand avenues and stately brownstones of the Upper East Side. And there, they built empires. This was the era that gave us the great New York department stores, many of which were founded by visionary German Jewish families. Names like Altman, Bloomingdale, and Strauss, who would come to own the iconic Macy's, utterly revolutionized how Americans shopped, inventing new standards of customer service and spectacle. In finance, they made similarly groundbreaking inroads. Shut out of the old money, Protestant-dominated Wall Street firms, brilliant men like Solomon Loeb and Abraham Kuhn simply started their own investment banks, creating powerhouses like Kuhn, Loeb, and Kofu that would grow into global giants. This generation was meticulously creating a new model of what it meant to be Jewish in America, wildly successful, deeply philanthropic, and fiercely patriotic. By 1880, the Jewish population of New York had swelled from just a few hundred to around 80,000. The German Jews had built a magnificent, seemingly stable structure. They believed they had laid the foundation for all Jewish people who would follow. They had no idea that a human tidal wave was about to crash upon their shores. A wave of people so different in language, custom, and belief that it would challenge everything they had so carefully built and remake New York City forever. Part 3. The Great Wave, Forging the City's Soul, 1880-1924. It all started with a bomb. In March of 1881, the reform-minded Russian Tsar Alexander II was assassinated by revolutionaries. The reactionary government, needing a convenient scapegoat to deflect public anger, immediately pointed its finger at the Jews, unleashing a devastating wave of pogroms, state-sanctioned, organized massacres that swept through the Jewish towns and villages of the Russian Empire. This campaign of terror, combined with the crushing burden of new anti-Jewish laws, triggered the single largest and most rapid migration in modern Jewish history. Between 1881 and 1924, an astonishing 2.5 million Jews fled the persecution of Eastern Europe. Their destination, almost invariably, was New York City. The city's Jewish population exploded, rocketing from 80,000 in 1880 to over 1.5 million by 1920. In the span of a single generation, New York City was transformed into the largest Jewish city in the world, and indeed, in history. These were not the assimilated, upwardly mobile, German-speaking Jews of the prior wave. These were the Yiddish-speaking masses from the impoverished shtetls of Poland, Russia, and the Pale of Settlement. They were destitute, traditional, and often traumatized. They came not as individuals seeking opportunity, but as whole families, even whole communities, running for their very lives with no intention of ever going back. After a dangerous and difficult journey to European ports, they were packed by the thousands into the dark, suffocating, foul-smelling steerage class of massive steamships. For weeks, they endured the brutal Atlantic crossing, sustained only by the dream of the Golden Medina, the Golden Land. Their first stop was the daunting inspection halls of Ellis Island, and from there they poured into one small, impossibly crowded corner of Manhattan, the Lower East Side. The Lower East Side became the teeming, chaotic capital of Jewish America. Streets like Hester, Orchard, and Delancey were a jarring symphony of life, packed with shouting pushcart vendors, bewildered new arrivals, and a sea of humanity. You could walk for blocks and hear nothing but the lyrical, urgent sounds of Yiddish. The air itself was thick and heavy with the smells of pickles curing in the barrel, of fresh challah baking in tenement ovens, and of the ever-present sweat of industry. They crammed into infamous dumbbell tenements, dark, airless fire traps where families of 8 or more might live in just 2 rooms, often taking in boarders just to make the exorbitant rent. From these crowded, unsanitary homes, they went to work. Many had brought with them skills in the needle trades, a craft that fit perfectly with New York's booming garment industry, an industry largely owned and managed by the earlier, more established German Jewish immigrants. It was a perfect, if often brutal, synergy. By the late 1890s, an estimated 60% of New York's Jewish workers were employed in the garment trade. They toiled in so-called sweatshops, which were often just dangerously overcrowded rooms inside the tenements themselves, for 11, 12, even 15 hours a day. They were paid by the piece in a relentless, exhausting cycle that barely kept them from starvation. The established German Jews of the Upper East Side looked at these newcomers with a complex mixture of pity and profound fear. They saw them as loud, unrefined, and stubbornly clinging to an old-world language and a form of orthodox religion they had tried so hard to leave behind. They worried this huge, impoverished influx would fuel anti-Semitism across the city and undo all the progress they had made. Still, they felt a heavy sense of responsibility, funding a network of institutions designed to Americanize the new arrivals. But the immigrants largely built their own support systems, Landsmannschaften, which were mutual aid societies made up of people from the same European hometown. And out of the squalor, they created a culture of breathtaking vibrancy. The Lower East Side was home to dozens of competing Yiddish newspapers, a thriving literary scene of poets and intellectuals, and the world-famous Yiddish theater on 2nd Avenue. The Jewish Rialto, where they could see their own struggles and triumphs reflected on stage. But this vibrant world was built on a foundation of exploitation. Many immigrants had brought radical political ideas with them from the old country: socialism, anarchism, and a fierce, deeply ingrained belief in the power of unions. The uprising of the 20,000 in 1909, a massive and risky strike of shirtwaist makers, was led by determined young Jewish women demanding better pay and safer conditions. Their struggle and sacrifice laid the essential groundwork for the modern American labor movement. The desperate need for this fight was burned forever into the city's conscience on the afternoon of March 25, 1911. A fire tore through the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory near Washington Square Park. The owners, wary of theft and unauthorized breaks, had locked the exit doors. Trapped inside, 146 workers, most of them young Jewish and Italian immigrant women and girls, perished by smoke or jumped to their deaths. The tragedy horrified the nation and became a powerful catalyst for the movement for workplace safety laws. The Great Wave came to an abrupt end in 1924 when the U.S. passed the Johnson-Reed Act, a deeply xenophobic and restrictive immigration law specifically designed to halt the flow of Eastern and Southern Europeans. The gates to the Golden Land were slammed shut. But in just 4 short decades, these immigrants had utterly forged the city's soul. They infused New York with a Yiddish-inflected energy, a boundless cultural dynamism, and a progressive political spirit born of struggle. They had arrived as desperate refugees, but they had become quintessential New Yorkers, and in doing so, had redefined what it meant to be one. Part 4. The Third Wave, Rebuilding and Diversifying, post-1945, present. The closing of the gates in 1924 didn't end the story. It just changed its direction. The children and grandchildren of the Lower East Side, armed with education and ambition, moved out and up. They fanned out across the city, building new, thriving Jewish centers in the outer boroughs, in Brooklyn neighborhoods like Brownsville and Crown Heights, and in the South Bronx. Then came the unimaginable darkness of the Holocaust. When the war finally ended, a new and profoundly different kind of Jewish immigrant began to arrive on New York's shores. The survivor. These were not people seeking opportunity in the traditional sense. They were the shattered remnants of a completely destroyed world, arriving with unimaginable trauma, but also an unbreakable, almost defiant will to live. Many of these survivors settled in areas like Williamsburg and Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. They brought with them a new, fervent religious intensity, establishing deeply traditional communities with a singular mission. Ultra-Orthodox Hasidic sects like the Satmar in Williamsburg and the Lubavitch in Crown Heights sought to meticulously reconstruct the vibrant European worlds that had been turned to ash. They created insular, self-sufficient societies, with Yiddish once again serving as their primary language, oases of tradition in a modern world. The next major wave wouldn't come until the 1970s, and it would come, once again, from Russia. When the Soviet Union briefly and unpredictably relaxed its emigration rules, a flood of Soviet Jews poured into New York City, fleeing institutional anti-Semitism and a crumbling, oppressive society. They found their new home in a faded seaside Brooklyn neighborhood that soon became nicknamed Little Odessa, Brighton Beach. These immigrants were different yet again. They were often highly educated professionals, doctors, engineers, scientists, but decades of state-enforced atheism had left them with little to no connection to religious Judaism. Their identity was cultural and ethnic, not spiritual. They completely transformed Brighton Beach into a vibrant, nostalgic slice of the old country, where storefront signs are in Cyrillic and the shops are filled with Russian books, foods, and newspapers. Like every wave before them, they carved out their own unique and distinct version of Jewish life in New York. And the story doesn't stop there. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st, New York also became a magnet for Sephardic Jews, fleeing instability in Syria and Egypt, and for Jews from Israel, Latin America, and post-revolutionary Iran. Each group added another intricate layer, another distinct flavor, to the city's impossibly complex Jewish identity. The community's footprint expanded and shifted dramatically. While many families moved out to the suburbs of Long Island and Westchester, the population also redistributed itself within the 5 boroughs. Queens became home to a large and thriving middle-class Jewish population. In Brooklyn, neighborhoods like Borough Park and Williamsburg became overwhelmingly and visibly Orthodox. Today, a demographic shift has occurred. Nearly half of all New York City's Jews now live in the borough of Brooklyn. From the 23 frightened Sephardim on the dock, to the refined German merchants of the Upper East Side, to the Yiddish-speaking masses of the Lower East Side, to the Hasidic families of Williamsburg and the Russian professionals of Brighton Beach, each wave confronted, challenged, and ultimately influenced the ones that came before. This created a dynamic of constant tension and fusion that keeps the community perpetually evolving. This is the modern Jewish metropolis, a breathtaking mosaic of dozens of different communities, all bound together by a shared, centuries-long history in the city they helped build. From a muddy dock in a provincial 17th-century trading post to the glittering avenues of a 21st-century global capital, the journey of New York's Jewish community is an almost impossible, truly epic story. It began with just 23 refugees fighting for nothing more than a place to land. It swelled with German idealists who dreamed of a new kind of American Judaism, exploded with 2 million Eastern Europeans who filled the city's factories and fueled its growth, and was rebuilt and redefined by the haunted survivors of the Holocaust and the secular refugees from the Soviet Union. Each wave was distinct, bringing its own language, its own traditions, and its own vision of the future. They clashed over religion, politics, and culture. They debated what it meant to be a Jew and what it meant to be an American. And ultimately, through that friction, they forged one another and their city into something entirely new. Their influence isn't a secret, not if you know where and how to look. It's in the very fabric of the city's economy, woven by the millions of stitches set by the tailors who built the garment industry. It's in the city's political DNA, a particular brand of social liberalism and progressive fervor that was nurtured in the tenements and on the picket lines in the fight for workers' rights. It's in the city's unparalleled cultural life, on Broadway stages, in legendary publishing houses, in world-class concert halls, all fields where Jewish New Yorkers have made a profound and indelible mark. This is the story of how a diverse community of immigrants, driven from their homes by persecution and drawn here by a fragile promise, didn't just find a home in New York, but actively and relentlessly shaped it into the metropolis we know today. The very qualities they needed to survive: resilience, intellectual curiosity, and a talent for creative adaptation, became the engines of a new kind of dynamic urban life. That iconic skyline that shouts ambition was indeed built by many hands. But the city's soul, its restless energy, its constant intellectual ferment, its profound and unshakable belief that a better world can be fought for and won, that soul speaks with a distinct Yiddish accent. The secret history isn't just that New York has a Jewish story. It's that New York's essential character is, in so many ways, a Jewish one. A city forged in the fires of immigration, forever arguing, forever striving, and forever remaking itself anew. If this history fascinates you, consider visiting powerful places like the Lower East Side Tenement Museum or the Museum of Jewish Heritage to see and feel these stories up close. And if you want to explore more hidden histories that have shaped our world, Be sure to subscribe and join us for our next journey.